Teaching college freshmen, I asked my class to locate France on a world map. After 10 minutes of silence, one student raised her hand and pointed to Australia. When I corrected her, she argued, "But they both start with vowels and have fancy accents." Another student insisted that France was somewhere near Canada because they both speak French. These weren't remedial students, they were honors program candidates who had somehow graduated high school without basic geographical knowledge that most elementary students worldwide possess. During a literature discussion about Romeo and Juliet, my high school senior asked if Shakespeare was that old British guy who copied Disney movies. When I explained that Shakespeare predated Disney by centuries, she looked genuinely confused. She then insisted that Disney's version was probably better because Old English is too hard to understand and Disney makes everything more relatable to modern audiences. She couldn't grasp that Disney adaptations were based on classical literature, not the other way around. She spent the rest of class arguing that studying original versions was pointless when updated versions existed. My college student submitted a research paper about World War II that claimed Hitler was defeated by American superheroes like Captain America who fought against the Nazi Empire. She had confused Marvel movies with historical events. When I pointed out that Captain America was fictional, she replied, "But I saw the documentaries. They showed him fighting in the war." She was referring to Marvel films as historical documentation. She rewrote the paper but included Iron Man and Thor as other American heroes who helped win World War II. When I failed her, she complained to the dean about my bias against alternative historical sources and demanded credit for creative historical interpretation. Working as a substitute teacher, I encountered a high school class where students couldn't perform basic arithmetic without calculators. When I asked them to calculate 15% tip on a $20 bill, they stared blankly until I allowed phone use. Even with calculators, several got the wrong answer because they couldn't figure out how to convert percentages to decimals. These were seniors in advanced placement courses who had somehow reached 12th grade without mastering elementary mathematical concepts that most middle schoolers handle easily. My college history student wrote an essay claiming that Abraham Lincoln invented freedom and was the first person to think slavery was wrong. She described the Civil War as Lincoln single-handedly fighting against all the other Americans who loved slavery. When I provided sources about abolitionist movements predating Lincoln, she dismissed them as fake history, because everyone knows Lincoln freed the slaves by himself. She couldn't accept that historical movements involved multiple people over decades rather than single heroic individuals solving complex problems instantly. Teaching basic science, I had a student argue that gravity was just a theory because she had seen videos of people floating in space. When I explained that space lacks gravitational pull from nearby massive objects, she replied, "But if gravity was real, how could airplanes fly?" She genuinely believed that flight disproved gravity and demanded equal classroom time for alternative physics theories that didn't contradict her intuitive understanding of how objects move. During a civics lesson about the 3 branches of government, my high school student asked why America needed a president, Congress, and that other thing, when one smart person could just make all the decisions faster. When I explained checks and balances, she replied, "But that's so inefficient. Companies have one CEO who decides everything. Why can't government work like a business?" She couldn't grasp why democratic governance might require different structures than corporate management. She concluded that the Constitution was poorly designed, and that America should elect a CEO president with unlimited power to make decisions quickly without all the arguing. She wrote her final project proposing to eliminate Congress and the Supreme Court for governmental efficiency. My college English students submitted a literary analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird that focused entirely on why Atticus Finch should have used social media to expose racism instead of boring court stuff. She couldn't understand that the novel was set in the 1930s, insisting that Harper Lee was just old-fashioned for not including modern technology. When I explained historical context, she replied, "But books should be relatable to modern readers." She wanted to rewrite classic literature to include contemporary elements. Teaching world geography, I discovered that my high school seniors believed that all countries used American currency because dollars are the best money. One student was shocked to learn that Europeans didn't use quarters and dimes. When I showed them various international currencies, a student asked, "Why don't these countries just switch to American money so everything would be easier?" They couldn't grasp that other nations had sovereign monetary systems and didn't exist to convenience American travelers. During a biology lesson about evolution, my student raised her hand and said, If humans came from monkeys, why don't we have tails? When I explained that humans and primates evolved from common ancestors rather than linear progression, she replied, "But that's too complicated. Evolution should be simple, like in Pokemon, where things just change into better versions." She based her understanding of biological processes on video game mechanics rather than scientific evidence.
The U.S. education system has many critics who see a continuing deterioration in our schools. Thomas Sowell, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, is one of those. As the older generation of teachers and professors leave, he says, new trends and counterproductive fads, fashions, and dogmas of American education will become the dominant influence and shape the generations to come. In short, he argues, American schools are turning out students who are not intellectually incompetent, but also morally confused, emotionally alienated, and socially maladjusted.
Back in 1966, there were about twice as many C's as A's given out in the public schools in the United States. By the late 70s, there were twice as many A's as C's. So you have this long period during which all sorts of test scores are going down. At this very same time, grades are going up.
Is that going on at both the elementary, secondary level, and college level?
At the college level. During the entire decade of the 1980s, the percentage of A's at Yale University never fell below 40%.
So you're saying there's a great inflation going on, and there are declining test scores.
Yes. And this is part of the deception. When I was teaching back in the 1960s, I kept hearing that this was the brightest and best generation that we'd had, and I kept saying they don't seem to be enrolling in my courses. And it was only well into the 70s before the word came out that the data showed just the opposite of what the educators were saying.
And now it would seem that a good many educators are in agreement with you when they talk about the serious straits that our American schools are in.
They agree in the sense only that this kind of talk gets them more money. And in fact, that's used as the biggest reason why we need more money. But in point of fact, the money spent on education was rising by leaps and bounds, and this is known as affective education, as if you can somehow educate people's feelings rather than to educate their intellect. And the problem is that most public school teachers have no such qualifications, if anyone has such qualifications. But certainly they are not psychiatrists or psychologists. They have no idea of the emotional turmoil they may be stirring up in the students, and there's some evidence that that's happening in terms of medical reactions of vomiting, signs of nerves in various ways. But more than that, what they tend to do is to try to alienate the child from the parent. And I think that's the most dangerous thing they do.
How did they do that?
Well, if you read the literature, it's just astonishing how parents are depicted in the literature as people who are hung up, who have old-fashioned ideas. But it's not sex education as such, because there are a whole series of kinds of education of the emotions, as they would put it, which do the same thing. And the idea is that the child is supposed to make his own decisions, and he's supposed to pick his own values on which to make those decisions. So the whole history of the human race is sort of thrown out the window, and Johnny is supposed to start and draw upon his entire 8 or 9 years of experience in the world to decide what his values ought to be.
Dr. Thomas Sowell of the Hoover Institution. His new book is called Inside American Education, The Decline, the Deception, the Dogmas. Talk about some of the dogmas that you feel are driving American education.
And one of the questions that were asked these kids was, are you good at math? 23% of the Koreans said yes. Something like 68% of the Americans said yes. And so American kids felt good about themselves, but they didn't know any math. Another study was done of 12th graders in Japan to see if they liked math. The 12th graders in Japan disliked math more than the 12th graders in the United States, and probably for good reason, because it was probably hard at math. But the Japanese don't worry themselves about whether their 12th graders like math. They worry
or
themselves.
Feel good about
That's
themselves.
Right. They don't care. The fact is, when you come out of there, you're going to know a certain amount of stuff. A lot of these programs are really a substitute for hard work by the teachers. I mean, when I think of the teachers I had, they could not have cared less whether I felt good about myself. They didn't ask me, how did you get to school? Did you walk these 15 blocks from home? Or did you have money for the trolley? They couldn't have cared less. They wanted to make sure I had better have my homework when I got there, and it had better be right.
Are you putting most of the responsibility here on the teachers themselves? What about the parents?
The parents have their responsibilities as well. on the whole, the parents, I think, turn out a lot better than the education establishment. The education establishment is very good at blaming everything on parents. The parents and the public have been pushing the schools to have more academic material, and the schools have been pushing in non-academic directions. And by and large, the schools have been winning, that more and more fancy fads and gimmicks have been coming into the schools. Very often people say, the Catholic schools do so much better with so little money. And I've come to think that really I don't want to take anything from the Catholic schools, but I think the fact that they have less money may be one of the reasons why they're doing so well, because they cannot afford these expensive gimmicks and fads. The social tragedy of it is especially hard on low-income people. You see, if you're low income, you're either going to get a good education or you're going to stay in poverty. The great problem with education throughout is that people are not accountable. They can run those schools to indulge themselves, whether for whatever fad they like, for whatever way they like to teach, and that goes all the way through to the colleges. The professors are there to do their research, and if the students don't get in the way, they don't mind. But those schools are not being run as places for teaching.
All right, so in addition to school choice, what else?
Oh, elimination of tenure at all levels. Well, that may not be universally popular, but they've done it in England, so it can be done. As long as people are rewarded just for being alive and sitting there for a certain number of years.
Everybody keeps blaming the fact that the schools aren't doing well on lack of resources, and it's not just money that's the problem.
Not only is it not just money, I would even argue that the country has been generous to a fault. You look at other countries around the world, that includes Japan, Australia. The average American kid gets twice as much money spent on him as the average kid in New Zealand. Kids in New Zealand are doing a lot better. They're getting a lot more spent on them than was spent on the kids in my era. And they're doing much worse than the kids in my era. I mean, I had to send my daughter to a private school to get an education almost as good as I got in the public school for nothing. Tragically, this is the view of the education establishment, that is what the school is supposed to be doing. What's so ironic is the school is failing so miserably in what they're paid to do that they should take on this role of being social philosophers. And when you think of the pitiful academic background of the people who are taking on this kind of job, you also wonder what can be going through their minds at all. It's not true that we're becoming a multicultural nation for the first time. This country had people who were speaking umpteen different languages, probably to a greater degree 70 or 80 years ago than today. Because you had vast numbers of people. I know people today who are professors and whatnot who say, we never spoke English in my home. In Washington, D.C., they have some of the highest expenditures per pupil and some of the lowest scores in the country. In fact, a few years ago, I saw some data on the different states. Of the 5 top states at that time, and it may still be true, in test scores, all were below the national average in expenditure per pupil. So it has no effect on anything except as a red herring confusing a lot of other issues. People ask, why then do the people in the suburbs fight to prevent this from happening? Because there are advantages. I take Palo Alto High School as a classic example. Palo Alto High School has 6 tennis courts, some of which I've used, even though I never went to Palo Alto High School. Is the way teachers are allocated. That is, typically teachers start out in a good middle-class school, and it turns out they're awful. They'll be moved on to another school and another. And eventually, they'll start moving them down the social ladder to neighborhoods where the parents are less educated, less affluent, less influential, less able to make trouble. And so they end up teaching those kids for whom education is their only road out of poverty. Not only in California, but elsewhere, there's constant shuffling of teachers around, which is done, by the way, simply because of the high cost of firing them. When I wrote a book on education a few years ago, I said it was $50,000 to fire one incompetent teacher. It's been shown again and again that in one generation, people can do remarkable things with a decent education. Jaime Escalante did this out in California with the Hispanic kids who scored so high on the calculus test that the Educational Testing Service could not believe it.